Okay, hello history class. So last time we were together, I went over the beginning of chapter 16, which again, this chapter is on Reconstruction, building back the nation after the Civil War. The last thing that I went over in that section of notes was the assassination of President Lincoln, which means his successor would need to take over. And as we said last time, his successor is Vice President Andrew Johnson. So he takes over the presidency, and we are now at the top of the next page. It should say Andrew Johnson at the top. Okay, so that's where I'm going to start. So Andrew Johnson, like Lincoln, favored lenient plans of Reconstruction. So that number 1 point says favored lenient, L-E-N-I-E-N-T, plan for Reconstruction. So believed like his predecessor did. Second thing, he began putting his plan into effect himself without consulting legislatures. So consulting is that next blank. Lincoln did this sometimes during his presidency, and Johnson was basically following suit. Then the starred part here in that section says these issues set the stage for battle between Congress and the presidency. So Congress is the first blank on that last line, and presidency is the next blank. It was going to be a rocky road here. All right, the next section is Johnson's plan. So Johnson issued broad amnesty. There's that word again that means pardon. Amnesty is A-M-N-E-S-T-Y to most former Confederates, just as Lincoln was hoping to do. Second bullet point, he allowed Southern states to organize new state governments. State governments is that blank. Next bullet point, they were allowed to elect representatives to Congress. Congress is the next bullet point. Fourth bullet point, to do all these things though, the state must abolish slavery, abolish is that blank, and ratify the 13th Amendment. So 13th is that next blank. Could not do those other things like reorganize state government or elect representatives to National Congress if they did not abolish slavery and ratify the 13th Amendment. And again, the 13th Amendment, as we looked at yesterday, was the abolition of slavery in the United States. So they had to all ratify that or approve that amendment. And then the last bullet point said that most states complied with all of these things that Johnson set forth by fall of 1865. So the ball was rolling for his plan at this point. However, then by December of 1865, though, there were a lot of things that Congress had noticed whenever they went back in session. So Congress's reaction is the next section there. So here we go. Congress, December 1865, when it was back in session, Congress convened to find representatives and senators, those are your two blanks, elected by white Southerners. Most of them, or many of them, were former Confederate leaders. So Confederate is that last blank. In other words, Congress reconvenes. They come to see that a lot of Southerners had elected their leaders, representatives and senators, but a lot of them were former Confederate leaders, and that's what they were hoping to avoid. Obviously, because those were the people that led them into secession to begin with. Second bullet point, Congress then therefore quickly rejected Johnson's approach. So Johnson's, Johnsson''S. So how did Congress react to this? Number 1, they refused to seat Southern representatives and senators. Southern is your next blank. Wouldn't allow them to take their seats. Secondly, the two houses appointed a committee's the next blank, to form a new plan for the South. So basically they were looking to regroup at this point. This committee, when in session, heard testimony about black codes. So that's the next line under that number 2. Black codes, I have that defined here. They were new laws used by Southern states to control African Americans. In other words, if they couldn't have slavery, they were going to still try to suppress them and oppress them in other ways. These black codes were meant to replace slavery with near slavery. So that's your next blank, near slavery, NEAR dash slavery, SLAVERY. An example of this would be the state of Mississippi. African Americans could not vote, that's your fill in the blank there, or serve on juries, which was not how Congress pictured anything at all. But Mississippi, again, taking things into its own hands, probably had the wrong people in power. Some former Confederates, they weren't allowing African Americans to vote or serve on juries. Third bullet point, radical Republicans had 2 goals. Okay, so the radical Republicans were geared up so that they could see some things take place and move forward. Goals is your blank right there. The first thing, number 1, prevent former Confederates from regaining control of Southern politics. They did not want the same mistakes that already happened. So that was the first goal, prevent former Confederates from regaining control of Southern politics. Second thing, they wanted to protect freedmen. In other words, they needed to guarantee them the right to vote. That was one of the protections they wanted for them. So freedmen is the first blank there. And the second blank in that number 2 is guaranteeing them the right to vote. Vote is your second blank. One of the ways Congress wanted to go about doing this is they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, or at least that was their goal. Number 1, under this Civil Rights Act of 1866, we're in the next section, it granted citizenship rights to African Americans. So citizenship is the first blank there. That was first step. Second step was to guarantee civil rights, that's the next blank, to all people except, there's that except word again, except for Native Americans. So guaranteed civil rights, first blank, to all people except for Native Americans. So the line right below it says that this actually was vetoed by Andrew Johnson. It came across his desk. He vetoed it. That's the first blank, vetoed. But then, as we learned, a bill goes back to Congress so that they can vote on it again if it's vetoed by the president. Congress is the second blank. And this Civil Rights Act of 1866 was actually overturned by Congress despite of Johnson's veto, because 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate passed it. That's considered a majority. So it did indeed become a bill. Looking again to grant citizenship to rights of African Americans and guarantee civil rights to all people with the exception of Native Americans. And then finally, the 14th Amendment. Okay, the Congress was actually working on getting this passed too, because they wanted to seal the deal. They remembered the Dred Scott decision of years ago, where the Supreme Court ruled and declared that no one descended from an enslaved person could be a United States citizen. They wanted to make sure that the Supreme Court wasn't going to do anything to overrule this Civil Rights Act. So in order to do that, they needed a constitutional amendment. That's what the 14th Amendment was. It failed at first to win the approval of 3/4 of the states, but it was finally approved in 1868 after the radical Republicans took over. So what is the 14th Amendment? It is about citizenship. So that's our first blank in the next section. citizenship, right next to 14th Amendment there. First bullet point, this is what the amendment does. All people born, first blank, or naturalized, second blank, which naturalization is like going through the process to become a citizen of the United States of America. Anyone born or naturalized are U.S. citizens. Second bullet point, that states may not pass laws taking away citizens' rights. So states is the next blank. States did not have the power to do that. The 14th Amendment made them U.S. citizens, therefore they had the rights of U.S. citizens. Third bullet point, states cannot take away life, liberty, property without due process. Due process is your blank of law, meaning they had to go through all of the things like trial by jury, and to make sure that they were getting a fair trial, things like that, if things were going to actually be taken away from them. So due process. And fourth bullet point, a state that tried to deny any male citizen over 21 the right to vote, votes that blank right there, that state's representation in Congress would be reduced. So reduced is the second blank. So we know that every state has 2 senators, and we know that depending on a state's population, that's how many representatives they get in the House of Representatives. This amendment is saying that if a state tried to deny any male citizen over the age of 21 the right to vote, their representation in Congress would be reduced. They could take, for example, the number of representatives that they had, they could reduce it to a smaller number. Now, unfortunately, even though this provision was in there, it could have been a powerful tool even way back then, but it wasn't enforced for nearly 100 years, meaning it wasn't until the 1970s, almost 100 years later, that they actually enforced this whole reducing a state's representation and things like that. So it took a long while for it to actually have the power behind it that it needed to. But so those are our notes for today. So we will keep continuing. There's one other section in the book. Well, we have to continue the section 2 next time. And then there's a section 3 also that we're going to go over. So you should have 2 pages of notes left. But so that'll be that for today. All right. Thanks, guys.